And I want to welcome everybody for coming. I see that we've got people on the train, people as far afield as past Burundi today, and people from wherever they're joining us, from their desks or from their phones. We really appreciate you coming and keeping the professional learning going. Our guests might be interested to know that we have had professional learning almost every Tuesday from the beginning of the year, and we started it in mid of last year. So it's been a really wide range of topics and ideas, and we switch out between journal articles, between real knowledge and experiences of other people, and then we have a Tech Tuesday as well. So a big range of things for people to log into. This afternoon, it gives me unbelievably enormous pleasure. Ta-da! The nice thing when you're online is you can put hearts and flowers and sprinkles to welcome Associate Professor Laura Dyson, who is the Assistant Dean Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Humanities. And Maria, I don't have your whole CV, so I'm just going to say the amazing and wonderful Maria Przeski, who we have a great fondness for the Przeski family in this faculty, and we acknowledge where you come from and where you're going to. So we're very, very excited to have you both here this afternoon. This was at the initiative of Lizelle. Thank you very much, Lizelle, for pursuing it, who heard both of them speaking earlier on in the year about the concept of ungrading, which I'm not going to unpack at all. I'm going to leave it for them to talk to you about. And we really, really, really thought this was a conversation that we should be having in our sphere. And so we really appreciate you taking up the invitation. And we're looking very forward to hearing you chat with us. This is quite an informal group, so if people do interrupt or ask questions, we're not disciplined. So, all right. So I'm not sure which one of you is going to start, but you're both muted.
I'm going to start.
Okay, thanks, Laura. All right, so you go ahead.
And also just to say that I do have to leave at 5 to 5 to go and teach on the PG dip, but Maria will stay on a bit if need be. So if we could move, Maria, thanks. Start with the first slide. Right, so today we're going to do a few things. We're going to have a brief introduction and talk about some principles on assessment for learning and formative assessment, because I think these terms, I mean, we've seen them now in the new assessment standing orders at the university, but I still think there's quite a lot of confusion about what formative assessment actually is and how it works towards final marks and summative assessment and so on. We're also going to be looking at some of the innovations. I think we're all aware that there were a lot of these happening during emergency remote teaching and learning. So we're going to be maybe showcasing a few of those, and Maria is going to show us some of her amazing interesting strategy she's been using in her course at the School of Education. We love being interrupted, by the way, Shira. We are from the School of Education, so we need to practice what we preach. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for a discussion. So if we could move on, thanks. So there was a very interesting, I'm involved in the postgraduate diploma in higher education. I'm not the one at health sciences, the one that's run more generally within the university for the other 4 faculties. And one of our graduates, one of the alumni, after doing the PG dip, did a PhD in assessment in engineering. She's in electrical engineering and aeronautical engineering. And she was absolutely fascinated because of this complete obsession with marks. And she did a lot of focus groups with students and with lecturers. She found that students felt that lecturers were marks driven, and lecturers felt students were. So she wanted to try and understand what was going on and what the root of this problem was. But I thought that this was very interesting. She said that a theme that emerged was the notion that students were studying for passing rather than studying for learning. And I think that's really significant. And she interviewed students in all achievement groups. So she divided students up into top achievers, sort of more average middle achievers, and then I think what she called more borderline performers. And she said that this was prevalent in all groups, with this act of studying for passing approach as a conscious tactic for the high and mid-performing students, but was more as a survival tactic for the low-performing students. So that was really, really interesting. If we could just move on, Maria. I thought this was a very interesting quote from a student who said, "Some courses are structured such that the assignments that they give you are stuff they can't test in a written test. And usually in those particular situations, the stuff that you do for the assignments, you won't need for the exam. Those type of assignments usually get sent to the back of my list because they're not part of the core material of the course and they won't help me with the test and the exam. In other words, with the summative assessment. I'm going to ignore them. Whereas with some assignments, the assignment is linked to what you're given in the test and linked to what you'll get in the exams. So doing the assignment is actually helping you prepare for the test and the exam. So I tend to like to focus on those. And even though this was obviously a very strategic approach to learning, definitely, what we found quite disturbing about this was that the student was completely the approach to learning was totally shaped and influenced by the nature of the assessment. Formative assessment was seen as preparing students for summative assessment, and I think that's often a bit of a problem. So let's move on, and hopefully today we're going to be exploring some of these issues and how we, in our own way, maybe at the School of Education and some of the courses we run, are trying to move away from some of the traditional ways of assessing students, trying to challenge that mindset, which is prevalent all over the place, that marks are all that count, and that is what is influencing learning. Just to start with one of my own very striking experiences a couple of years ago, and we have very large numbers of students at the School of Education, well over 500 in a third year class that I teach. It was about 560 that year. And we always give feedback on their first assessment, which is an essay they write, and takes hours and hours, and we moderate the marking and have criteria, and we try and model for students how to mark properly and so on. And we worked out that about 30 to 40% of the students only collected their essays. In those days, they handed them in. Because they'd got their marks before collecting their essays. So, it was a real wake-up call for me, because I realized that all that hard work that had gone into the feedback, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, actually, was not really taken up at all by most of the students. What I'd like to start by saying is that ungrading, which is more of a concept than an actual strategy as such, is not so much doing away with marks altogether, but it's more the absence of grades. It's moving towards the absence of grades, in that students are still assessed on their assignments. So it's not doing away with assessment, which has huge value, but there are a variety of ways that assessment is seen as valuable for students and for teachers. And hopefully some of our examples today will illustrate that. And the important thing is that grades, as I've just described in the example I had, in the experience I had, kind of took the emphasis off feedback. Students didn't seem to be interested in that we thought valuable feedback. Maybe it wasn't valuable, and we're going to be talking about that today as well. But the grades definitely seem to predominate and take the focus away from the feedback. Stommel, J.C. Stommel, who's been writing for many years about this, and Maria will also talk about him a bit later, in an American and a Canadian context. He talks about grades motivating, but not promoting peak performance. And that's something really interesting. And alternative approaches, there's a kind of continuum in a way, that come out of many of the articles and the studies that have been done on this move towards away from the of mark obsession, mark-driven learning approaches, is to start working towards what they call grade-free zones, much more focus on self-assessment, what Bell Hooks refers to as continual self-evaluation. And this is something, I mean, what I've read about self-evaluation and seen in our students at education, it's something they really struggle with and haven't been taught to engage with adequately. Minimal grading, we're going to be showing you some examples of that today. So the scales have fewer gradations. Students aren't overwhelmed by grading scales, and rubrics that are fairly technical. Criteria are absolutely essential, but how they are mediated is what's crucial. Peer assessment, portfolios, certainly the Faculty of Humanities has moved a lot towards authentic assessment and portfolios during this time as a way of, it's also a way of designing out plagiarism, getting students to reflect on their own approach to learning, their own approach to handling a particular task. And again, we'll show you some examples of that. And as I said, more user-friendly rubrics and rubrics that students can engage with. And in some cases, the School of Education tries to get students to actually give input on the rubrics and play a role in designing the rubrics, but that's mostly with students at higher levels. Thanks, Maria. If we could just move on. So just to say that there's definitely been a shift in thinking about assessment over the last 20 years or so, where the paradigm has moved away from assessment of learning, which is more a kind of measurement model of assessment. How well has a student done? Do they know their work? Do they understand? And how do we make that judgment? To move towards assessment for learning. How can we use assessment to engage students and promote their learning and deeper understanding of concepts? There's also been much more of a focus on feedback, which powers further learning, and we're going to see that in some of the examples today, that feedback isn't just about giving and telling. So there's a new perspective on feedback, that all feedback is internally generated. If we could move on, please. Maria, I wonder if you could just come in here and talk about what we mean by feedback being internally generated.
Thanks, Laura.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, but exactly, because I've been thinking a lot about it of late. So Laura and I went to the Assessment in Higher Education conference in June in the UK. And so this was a sort of an idea that was being discussed in various papers, but also just everyone was getting quite excited about it. And it's a sort of a very obvious insight, but I think one that we've never actually stopped and considered the consequences of. And that is that, you know, a lecturer can give really excellent feedback. Laura's going to describe, you know, some of the characteristics of excellent feedback. But unless a student internalizes that, you know, unless the student invests in the learning and sees the value of the improvement that the feedback is trying to tell them to do, that feedback is actually pointless because it doesn't reach the student. So Nicol, this scholar, he's got a very kind of cognitivist language. So he talks about internal feedback as if it's this voice that's talking to you. But that's what he seems to mean. It's how can we use language that the students understand, you know, first of all, that relates to assessment. And second of all, reach them at places and motivations and investments where they see the value of the learning that they're going to get, so that they actually do it. Yeah. And that's
Thanks, Maria. And I think
of
what's also important is that internal, that generation of feedback, internal generation, is based on the students comparing is based on a comparison. So very often if you show students a model of what good writing or a good report looks like, or if they get feedback from a peer and from the lecturer, they're looking at it in relation to their own writing. And there's a lot that's been written about that comparison process, which is really, really interesting. Can we move on, Maria? Thanks. So the key shift in the locus of control is that students, instead of always being judged by the lecturer, the new thinking in assessment and assessment for learning is that students begin to develop that capacity to evaluate their own writing, their own work, their own understanding. The students often depend on staff to make judgments about their performance. So there's this kind of passivity, I suppose. And what Bard has argued, and he's an assessment scholar and has written for many, many years about assessment in Australia, Hong Kong, and the UK, he says that this inhibits the development of necessary graduate skills. Evaluative judgment is not seen as a required capability. His argument is that this is probably one of the most important things that students can get out of universities, to be able to make judgments that are sound and to justify those judgments. And so the Samble and Samble have also written logical practices that teaching and learning should be designed to create a situation where students are starting to take responsibility for their learning, to make informed judgments about their own work. And I suppose a lot of you are asking at this point, how do we empower students to start making those judgments and not always be so reliant and dependent on judgments from lecturers, which aren't always that useful, as Maria was saying. And that's what we're going to be looking at as well. Maria? So this is quite a nice table by Bard and Malloy, where they say this big shift has been, in the past, feedback to students. And feedback is often seen as the most powerful tool or strategy for shifting students, for promoting learning. But our students see feedback as input. It's unidirectional. It's telling students what to do. It's what's wrong with the work. The students are passive and dependent, as I said, and the lecturer or the tutor or the peer tutor is seen as an expert who focuses on delivering feedback, even the language of feedback, giving and taking. And this shift by these scholars is much more towards feedback as reflexive. So it's developing that reflexivity, that ability to reflect. You're making sense of the feedback. Do you know what the lecturer is saying when they say you're off the topic? Very often students don't. I work in the writing centre spaces and students don't understand a lot of the feedback that they get. Feedback that highlights successes and motivates students, as Maria said. That students become more active in seeking, interpreting, and using feedback. So the feedback isn't giving the answers, it's encouraging students to seek answers, to become more active, to take the initiative. So in a way, the shift has been towards lecturers as designers of assessment and of feedback. And what I've noticed in the UK at this conference Maria spoke about is it seems as if when students hand in a piece of work now, they don't just hand in the work, they actually hand in a kind of reflection where they say where they think their strengths and weaknesses are, high points, low points, whatever, and areas where they would like to get feedback. And that's really, much more empowering for students. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, how on earth can we do it with these large student numbers? And that's what Maria is going to be talking about in a moment. Can we move on, Maria? So that, as I said, I'm sort of repeating myself a little bit, but the new perspective on feedback is that feedback is only meaningful. It's just a mark until unless it's actualized by the student. And as I've said, they develop their self-reflective and self-evaluative abilities. A big way of doing this is to work with exemplars. So examples of good writing. Carlos, who's written a lot about this in China and Hong Kong, he talks about how from his research, students don't know what good quality writing often looks like. We've done quite a lot of research with our first year students, and that's certainly the case for them. They don't know what it means to write an argument, to use their own voice, to provide evidence, to explain things. So working with examples, and they don't have to be brilliant examples, they're ways of doing that. Working with and generating rubrics, not rubrics, as I said earlier, that shut down the thinking and that become tick boxes. That's the other thing that came out of that PhD work that I showed you right at the beginning, is what the researcher found is that students in her engineering context used rubrics as tick boxes. They just ticked them off, and so did the lecturers. So they weren't used to engage students with the criteria. What does it mean to formulate, to give a good explanation? What does it mean to describe something thoroughly? Students didn't know. And that also peer feedback is legitimated, and that's something that's quite interesting. Maria referred to a study where they're showing that in some cases peer feedback is more profound than feedback from lecturers and has more of an impact on students. There's a very strange noise, I don't know what it is. So self-reflection questions are included in tasks. And what we've started doing is that you return tests with feedback only. I told you about the 30 to 40% who didn't collect their essays. They're still lying in the secretary's office. So what we do now is we return the tests with no mark, only with feedback. And the students actually get their mark afterwards. But we do encourage a process of, as Maria says, students actually marking and determining how many marks they should lose and why, and building that into the program, designing in those sorts of feedback processes. Next slide, please, Maria. Yeah, so we're going to now be talking about some of the innovations for doing assessment differently to begin changing the culture around marks so that students aren't completely, and lecturers in some cases, geared towards summative assessment and marks. Yeah, so one of the things that we found works really, really well is when we build this kind of reflection into assessment tasks, where students, and this is part of the process of students becoming better able to make those judgments, where students actually have to say, and sometimes we even make this count. It sounds ironic in a workshop for ungrading, but at the moment that's what counts. So give it a weighting, you know, even if it's a couple of percent here and there, and we're going to talk about the marks thing in a moment. What do I feel about this feedback? What do I think about this feedback? What actions could I take to improve my work for another assignment? These are simple questions, but if we do this every time, students get into the habit, into the practice of reflecting. Also, one of the things we've been doing quite a lot of, especially during emergency remote teaching and learning, is getting students, as I said earlier, to actually hand this in, and it counts as part of their portfolio in some cases, but they need to reflect before they hand something in on the best aspect of the assignment. That is my, when I did all the illustrations. What did I struggle with? I struggled with these concepts. I'm expecting to get a 60%. If I'd had 5 more hours, I would have got a higher mark, etc. And they start thinking, and it's not just a kind of, it's really forcing them and requiring them to think more reflectively, which students often struggle to do. And we've noticed that in a professional qualification, they often really struggle to reflect on how they've learned, what they've learned, and how they've grown from a particular experience. Yeah, and process folios. Maria, again, if you wouldn't mind coming in here, but just to say that there's been a move towards process folios, we've noticed, where it's not so much on the portfolio where this is the evidence of my learning, but part of that is the way you reflect on your learning, and that's built into the process, which we think is quite an exciting development in the way portfolios are assessed and designed. We can move on, Maria. Right, and I think at this point I'm going to hand over to Maria, but just this last slide, I mentioned earlier this whole idea of minimizing marks. And as I said, having certain parts of the course that are grade-free zones. So just to give you an example, in an honours course that I'm involved with, what we do is students have to do a certain amount of reading responses over the course. That is, they have to write responses to certain course texts. And they won't get a mark for it, they'll just get feedback, but they will they do get a couple of % for handing in all their reading responses. We still haven't moved away from that completely, but students know that those tasks are formative, and they will, and they're about their own growth and development, and they will get feedback on that. If we could move on, Maria, and if I could at this point hand over to you, who Maria is now going to be talking about this very important issue of communication and what we often refer to as pandemic pedagogy or resilient pedagogy. So over to you, Maria, for some examples of what I've been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so it was during the pandemic, I suppose, that many of us got the courage to try some of these things. And these are also ideas that we then heard discussed at the assessment conference. So the one thing that I have been trying is exploring oral feedback. So this works well. It has worked for me better with smaller classes. So I have an honours class. And so you can do it on Ulwazi, or you can do it using Teams or Zoom. So when you open their work in SpeedGrader, or you can just share it, you know, as you would in a Teams or Zoom meeting, and then you talk through the work. If you're using SpeedGrader, you can highlight, you know, answers or you know, mistakes in reasoning, or for us, because I teach literacy and literature. So for me, it's written work. You can highlight phrases and talk about whatever needs to be spoken about. And then you record yourself doing that. You can record your face, you know, included, or it can just be your voice. And already that is much quicker. I find it much quicker than writing comments. And then if it's on SpeedGrader, it immediately pops up for the student there as a comment on the side. And otherwise you have to send them the link to Teams. And then you've got to fit that into your curriculum design. So if that's a draft or a formative task, then the students have to comment on your feedback. And they can do that very easily in Ulwazi by just typing a comment underneath or recording their voice back.
Maria, sorry to interrupt you. Have you changed the slide yet?
Not yet. That's coming.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
I'm going to show an example from my course. So these are ways where you actually use the affordances of the technology that we've sort of ended up with. So I don't know, you guys use Moodle a lot, don't you? But so then also exploring.
Maria, let me just interrupt.
Yeah.
This program actually uses Ulwazi. Only the
great.
School of Therapeutic Sciences uses Moodle. So
Okay,
we're all Ulwazi people.
Then you'll know what I mean. Yeah. And so then the other thing that this idea was bandied about in the conference, and I'm not quite sure whether I agree with it, but that LMSs are actually inauthentic in the sense that, you know, the students don't use them in any other part of their life. So that a thing we can also explore just in terms of digital communication is meeting students on platforms that they might use in other parts of their lives, such as blogs, such as TikTok. Yeah, so then that raises all sorts of questions about privacy and all that sort of thing. But a place where students are sort of more versed in the particular digital literacies of presenting themselves and discussing, those might be areas we want to explore, to get them to see the feedback, access it perhaps more easily, respond to it more quickly because they're in a familiar space. And last of all, this is an idea that I haven't tried, but I was reading about it and I thought it's something that it works very well apparently for skills-based courses. So the problem with a test often is it's one and done. They write a test, you know, even an MCQ, then they get their grade and it's gone. Whereas the opposite, which also depends on technology, digital technology, is a sort of what this scholar called Ribak calls a critique and mastery sequence, where there's a bank of tasks and the students do it and then send it for feedback. And you don't get a mark for it, you just get your mistakes. If it's not perfect, your mistakes are pointed out and you have to redo it again. And you go through as many iterations as you like until it's perfect. Then you choose another task. And at the end, you get, everyone's doing this constantly. And in the end, you get a mark for the term based on how many tasks you did, the range of tasks you tried, how many iterations, you know, how much effort you put in. And it was a coding lecturer who they then used sort of in the end had something you could do on Turnitin or Ulwazi. He had a huge bank of common responses that he could very quickly give. So the students are constantly working to perfect, to master particular skills that they see value in, rather than wanting a mark for a test that they then forget. So it's all these kind of ways of thinking about designing assessments that focus on does the feedback go somewhere? You know, is it leading to mastery? Which is what we actually want. All right. So here's my example of the screencast. So you can see it's just it was again one of those writing tasks that Laura was talking about. And then this is the screen from Screen Grader. It's a little bit Speed Grader, sorry. The page is squashed because I wanted to hide the student's name. And then there's my recorded comment. And then she's started to answer me here right down below. And then, so last year, I marked these by hand every week. This time I just recorded it. So, yeah. And the design, I suppose the real ungrading of that example is not the technology itself. The real example is that it's that feedback loop where they have to listen, they have to respond to the feedback, and then next week I have to see them implementing that feedback in their next task. So that's why that model only works for small groups, because it's quite labor intensive. And then this is an example from the complete opposite. So I have 518 first years this year. Some glitch or something that they let in far too many students. And so for a couple of years now, I've been working on iterations of a portfolio task, because this is the first time that a lot of them are doing extended writing about literature, which they've never done before. This is an introductory module to literature for kids who are going to be high school English teachers. And so this is something that I've seen in many different iterations of in the literature. So they will do a task where they're engaging with a poem and they're practicing reading skills and they're practicing writing skills. And it's open for peer feedback. So they work in tutor groups and they will be able to see each other's tasks, right? And that I don't mind, because this is a formative task. They're not going to get a mark. It's not going to get marked. It's going to, they do have to get some sort of participation mark, you know, to help them do it. But this right at the bottom then, it's just to try to, like Laura said, inculcate that habit that my learning is something I must be aware of. So right at the bottom there, it's just 2 ticks. And I've seen other examples. It was actually in a multiple choice exam for chemistry. And at the end of, after each multiple choice, it was just 3 emojis: a smiley face, a sad face, and a neutral face. And it was, how confident are you about your answer? And so this is something similar. So you're allowed to, if you really don't understand this poem at all, you're allowed to look, do peer learning, look at your colleagues' ideas, your classmates' ideas. You're allowed to do this task in the last 5 minutes before the deadline closes because that's all the time you have. But then I want you to honestly acknowledge that to me and to yourself. So that's just that tick. So yeah, it's all these ways of just, so then when students will have to, for the final take-home exam, they will select some of these tasks and rework them using the feedback that they've got in other ways. And so then here already, when they can see, I really loved that poem, but you know what, actually, I was so busy, I didn't put work in. So it's just that all these little tiny ways in this example, just to try to complete that cycle, to make them aware of the learning as they're doing it and coming back to it. And then, yeah, and that reflection is part of my course outcomes. It's part of the rubric that they use, and it's part of the final exam that they then submit. Because it's like Laura said, it is a bit kind of counterintuitive that aiming for ungrading, we sort of have to reward this kind of thinking in the marks. But I suppose it's not really the marks, but we're putting the reflection on feedback that we want, we're putting it into the assessment as a valued part of the assessment, so that that students can start changing their mindsets, hopefully, taking that responsibility that Samble and Samble talk about. Yeah. So I didn't want to give too many, this is a final example, is that my first year, so now I'm going to want them to write reflectively. They've never done such a thing. So therefore, threaded through my curriculum design and my tutorial tasks has to be some input on how to write reflectively. And so I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this. This is the Dieppe model. There are many models of reflective writing. You're often used in medical fields to get students to reflect on practical work. But I'm going to be asking the students to reflect on their reading, on their learning. And so even giving them the prompts there, useful sentence starters. And I haven't shown you the whole page, but then there's a color-coded example of an exemplar of a good reflection, and then another one of a weak reflection, and they will work through that with the tutor. And just while Laura and I were just sort of finishing off preparing this, I read a very interesting article by Samble and Graham about using exemplars. And so I think I'm going to have to go back and redesign this tutorial because they found that using the exemplar is excellent. The students have the criteria and they have the exemplar, and then they work in groups to mark the exemplars using the criteria. And that's when they understand what the criteria actually mean. And then, of course, once they've done that, you have group sharing, and the tutor makes sure that they're arriving at the accurate understandings of what words like analyze and justify, mean. It's feedback literacy. But Samble and Graham found that the efficacy jumps from about 50% to 90% if you actually get the students to try the task first on their own. They don't just write a draft, a quick draft, then show them the exemplars and they mark the exemplars, and then they mark their own. And they suggest that it's because that inner feedback is more successfully activated then. The students have already started to try to answer the questions, so they've started to notice, what do I need to know? How would I approach this? Those sort of tracks of thought have been started so that then they can understand the rubric and the exemplars so much better. So they talk about a produce, what's it? Produce, review, revise cycle. You produce your own, then you work with the exemplars and be guided to notice the things that you should be doing, and then you revise your own work. Yeah. So that there's so much more we could talk about, but the law I'll hand over to you, because this is that final example that you like so much from Jessie Stommel.
I mean, I've just seen a note from Querbus about, I suppose it's the issue of subjectivity, which Carlos talks about connoisseurship, that will never get away from that subjectivity. But I was just wondering, Querbus, if you want to come in with that example, yes. Because I think it's really, really important in relation to the criteria and sort of interpreting those criteria differently. You trying to bring in the experience of the students much more, say, than the external who's looking for a different set of skills, maybe. Querbus, I wonder if you want to come in here. Oh, so Querbus, you discussed the criteria with them beforehand, but they had a very different take on what constitutes, what was addressing them or not. Is that right?
Hi, Laura. Yes. So the scenario was that we had a clinical examination, and the specific station that we had was a cardiovascular examination. The details are not important, but we discussed it beforehand, and the person agreed that this and that was what they will examine. But afterward, we looked at the marks, and the other examiner had much lower marks than we had two examiners and the examiner in the other station. So we're wondering how to get a more objective examination, basically, instead of a subjective examination, because the one was, or maybe both of them, were looking at different things. And even if they had the same criteria, they interpreted the criteria differently.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting question, because we try to standardize the criteria, or the marking, certainly with our students, so that they try and mediate the criteria, not just give them a set of criteria, but sort of take them through it, and in some cases give them an opportunity to comment on them and to do some self-assessment and so on, if we can. But you raise a very important point about, multiple lecturers or an external moderator who might interpret those quite differently. I mean, I don't think we can ever get away from that subjectivity, but it's just valuing different, looking at different things, as, certain things count more than they would for you. I don't know if Shira or perhaps Lizelle want to comment on this, because I think it does raise a very important, issue and challenge.
Laura, I don't want to run into you running late for your next class,
Yeah.
But I do want to say that for all the clinical examinations that happen, examiners are supposed to be, so we say inverted commas, trained, but they're all, it's a kind of standardization of having that discussion, and there it is that you have to be open to somebody else's feedback about what counts as the criterion that you've put on the rubric. And so, for example, in the dental field, they give a whole range of tooth colors, and dentists are supposed to be able to say, oh, that's a 3, that's a 4, that's a whatever. But it's enormously interesting how very different their gradings are of the exact same thing. And so that counts also as to what the clinical skill is you're examining, and what counts as being a tick on the criterion or not. So those discussions should happen not only before the exam, but also after the exam, so that people can understand what the examiners were actually thinking when they did it. And we don't really have time to do that, but that's the ideal.
Yeah, and it also raises issues about authentic assessment and preparing people for the world of work, what that really is. You know, is that our role to do that? Well, obviously it is, but people are starting to look at some of those graduate attributes as a more important set of standards. That's something we can talk about just now if people are interested. But we thought we'd end today with this interesting task that Jesse Stommel, who's a big proponent of ungrading, in fact, his science courses, I can't remember which university he's at in the States at the moment, but he's almost done away very controversially. And you can look at he's quite active on Twitter. He's done away with marks completely in his course, and this is the kind of thing that he's setting for his students, and he believes that he's getting much better and higher quality outcomes and work and thinking. He's creating the sort of thinking environment. Write me a short letter, he says to his students, that reflects on your work in this class. Consider the work you did on the final project. So this is probably students who are a bit more advanced. Your work early in the term, the feedback you offered your peers on their work, and how you met your own goals. So I would assume that he's incorporated this into the teaching and learning program, you know, that assessment is very much part of the curriculum and it's aligned to the way he taught the course and his outcomes. Include links to examples of your work, so wanting the students to provide evidence. Did you miss any significant work? Is there anything you are particularly proud of? What letter grade would you give yourself? So maybe this is quite I thought we'd ask you what your view is of this. This is where he says we should be going, where students are starting to evaluate themselves. If a student says I should get 100% with not much justification, that's not going to happen. But it's all about the way that they justify, they explain, and the kind of the high order thinking almost to talk about their own writing, their own performance, their own contribution in class, and so on. Any comments? Do you think we are anywhere near ready for this kind of approach? I mean, I think that we've been working a bit more incrementally, not so much. I mean, I think ungrading is more of a kind of a metaphor, wouldn't you say that, Maria?
Yes.
It's not something we can really aim for, particularly given the structures within which we work, but we're certainly trying to move towards a different approach, a different paradigm to looking at assessment. And I think it's happening much more as really engaging students with their learning, as Maria said. I'd really like to hear from you what some of your views are on this sort of approach. I mean, this is probably an extreme version. Rizal, you make such an interesting point about trust.
Yeah, a lot of the literature is a lot about trust, trusting the students and trusting ourselves, you know, because great marks are so comforting. You feel you're getting somewhere, and the students as well. They feel, okay, I'm fine, I'm passing. Oh, I'm passing. You know, so a lot of the people who try this talk about anxiety and about managing our own anxiety and the anxiety of the students, you know, and that's why communication is so central. It's continually communicating with them why we're doing this, and yeah. Pearl, yes. Are we ready for ungrading in the South African context? Where would we even start? Jesse Stommel, what's that nice quote, Laura, that he starts that book with? You know, that's sort of what we do in education, is you just start changing what you can change, even if you know that the big changes are only going to happen in a very, 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 very long time. Yeah. Is it applicable? So I think, Cobus, that's it. You know, that's where we have to sort of start. If I'm going to get an external examiner in, I have to explain that my approach, you know, and they talk about flying under the radar. Sometimes you can fly under the radar a bit with your grade-free zones and that sort of thing, and then still produce a final mark. That's what I'm trying with this large class of mine. They are going to get a final mark, but I'm not. I've dropped the assignment. There's only a take-home exam, you know. It's also because there's so many of them and we've only got 5 weeks with them.
Yeah, and
So,
Lizelle, sorry, Paul, if I could respond to your question as well, where would we start? Hopefully we've shown you a few small possibilities for embedding in your courses, but if I could just say that one of the things we've started doing is I suppose what's called cumulative assessment, where going right back to that original quote I showed you where the students saw things as irrelevant. If it's irrelevant for the final, I'm not going to do it. But if it's relevant, so what we do is in a way we play into that a bit. So all the tasks, the smaller tasks feed into the bigger tasks. They all sort of prepare students for that final summative assessment in a way, but the nature of the tasks is such that they involve more activity on the part of students, more reflection, more engagement, more maybe self-assessment and peer assessment. But they will, and then perhaps they select some evidence of their learning on the course, but we cannot not give students marks for that. We don't want to be completely reliant on that final assessment mark. I don't know if you agree with that, Maria.
Yeah.
So we definitely need to, and at the standing orders at WITS is now saying that that final assessment should not be more than 40%. That all the other little tasks that feed into it cumulatively should also, should sort of build up to it. So in a way, I think that it's important that the students are signaling this, but let's make it, let's focus on the learning. Let's not focus on the marks per se. And it's a very hard shift for students because they are so mark oriented. And I like what you say there, Lizelle. If we start with valuing the smaller achievements, we move them away from just focusing on that test, and they see the relevance of those smaller tasks for the big one.
Yeah. And something I'm very interested in, although it's not something we do at all in education yet, I think it's something that you guys are doing more already, is what they are now calling programmatic assessment. So this model we have where you write a module or a course and then you write it off, you get your mark, and all your percentages add up to a pass or fail mark for the year, and then so you can actually pass your entire degree, without anyone ever looking at your holistic development, particularly for professional degrees like teaching and medicine. And I think you guys already, at least you because of your inquiry-based approach, you are you can look at that sort of the development of intertwined knowledge of anatomy and physiology, and as they develop over the first block and then over the second block. Because I think this kind of ungrading would work so well for the kind of longitudinal skills like academic literacy, for us, argumentation, that they have to, pedagogical thinking, that they've got to develop over all 4 years of their degree. But that requires sort of planning and designing assessment at school level, not even at division level.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different way of thinking about assessment that we just don't do yet.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Maria. And Maria, maybe, unfortunately, I have to go and teach now, but if you could also talk about the multiple choice and the objective test, because it's something, Maria, like her dad, trains us a lot with how it's very, very hard to set good multiple choice tests that are not just recall questions. So we've been using them much more, particularly in this online space. And I think that they can also be a very good measure for students as to how well they're doing, and to encourage that meta reflection. But what I want to say in response to somebody was said that I can't remember what it was. There was a point I wanted to make about subjectivity. Maybe Kobus, it's that I think that Yeah, there are ways of, you know, I suppose people like Biggs, who wrote a lot about standards-based assessment, about setting criteria and the importance of criteria, have often said that the criteria themselves are pretty objective. It's what we do with them. And I think there has to be that shared understanding in a way as much as possible. I mean, we've seen that with standardization. I mean, you'll laugh about this, but I've been in marking situations in some of the social science courses in the faculty where we've had a range of marks from 80 to a fail, all marking one essay.
Yeah.
So, you know, and someone marking it globally and someone else using the criteria. So at least the criteria are giving us some sense of a basis on which to make those decisions. But I think it does require a lot of mediation. I don't know if you want to come in here, Shira, as well.
No, Laura, I don't want to keep you late. So I know you've got another class to teach.
Yeah.
And that, I think, opens another huge discussion. I mean, this is a discussion space. And I really thank you both for giving of your expertise, but also opening the conversation for us in a way that we can understand. So consider a job well done, that everybody's now going to rush around talking about ungrading. But we can also open the idea that for us, a lot of our courses are much more integrated. And so the idea that you could look at an assessment policy or an assessment idea through different environments is great, because what tends to happen is if only one course adopts something, then it becomes something peculiar to that one course rather than a philosophy or a way that students can learn. So if we integrate the idea that the way that they learn has to be different for the way we're going to assess them, I think it's a really nice start. So I want to thank you guys for giving of your time. I want to thank everybody for coming along, even though it's late on a Tuesday afternoon. And we look very forward to continuing the discussion. Thanks so much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.